The crash happened at 11:47 on a Thursday morning in September, on the corner of Aldrich and Fenwick, and it was not, technically speaking, a crash so much as it was a slow and inevitable contact between a Rolls-Royce Ghost in deep garnet and a stainless steel food cart that had occupied that corner every weekday morning since June of the previous year. The Rolls moved first. It had been pulling out of the private garage of 211 Aldrich, which was a 6-story mixed-use building whose ground floor contained a dry cleaner, a florist, and a firm that described itself on its frosted glass door as a private investment office, and the driver of the Rolls had been looking at her phone. She had been on a call. She had the call on the car's system and was talking and driving at the same time, which she did often, and which worked well enough in circumstances that did not include a stainless steel food cart on the corner she was pulling onto. The front left quarter panel of the Rolls made contact with the right side of the cart at approximately 4 miles per hour. The contact was enough to push the cart off its wheel locks and send it pivoting sideways, and to dislodge 2 stainless steel containers from the front shelf, one of which, the larger, containing what appeared to be a significant volume of seasoned rice, landed on the hood of the Rolls. The driver of the Rolls stopped. She got off the call. She looked at the hood of her car, which now contained a pile of rice, and the stainless container that had held it. She put the car in park and got out. The man who ran the cart was named Solomon Adeyemi, and he had been on the sidewalk 6 feet away when it happened, in conversation with a woman who had ordered oxtail and was waiting for it. And he had watched the contact between the quarter panel and the cart, and had watched the rice container land on the hood of the Rolls, and had said, to the woman waiting for the oxtail, "Please give me 1 moment." He walked to the cart and looked at it. He looked at the 2 containers on the ground and the one on the hood. He looked at the quarter panel of the Rolls. He looked at the woman who had gotten out of the car. She was looking at the rice on her hood. Her name was Petra Halloran. She was 52 years old and the managing partner of Halloran Capital, a private equity firm that she had founded at 38 with 2 partners who had since departed, and that she now ran alone, which was how she preferred to run things. Because alone meant that the judgment was hers, and the accountability was hers, and the gap between those two was 0, and a 0 gap between judgment and accountability was, in her experience, the condition that produced the best outcomes and the most honest thinking. The firm occupied the top 2 floors of 211 Aldrich, which was the building whose garage she had just pulled out of. And she had been in the middle of a conversation about the pricing on a secondary transaction when the cart had arrived, unanticipated, in her peripheral vision. She was a woman who managed multiple lines of information simultaneously as a professional habit, and who had sometimes allowed this capacity to extend to her driving, which was a known error she had not yet corrected in any durable way. She was a woman who was not accustomed to encountering things she had not anticipated. She had built her career on the premise that thorough preparation eliminated surprise, and the food cart on the corner of Aldrich and Fenwick was a surprise she had not prepared for, and the rice on the hood of her car was a further development that she was currently processing in real time. She said, to Solomon Adeyemi, "I'm going to need your insurance information." He said, "I'm not sure the cart has insurance that applies to this situation." She said, "The cart hit my car." He said, "With respect, the car hit the cart." She looked at him. He said, "The cart was stationary and locked. The vehicle made contact with the cart while pulling out of a stationary position." She said, "That's a matter we'll need to establish through the appropriate process." He said, "I agree." He said it in the same register in which he said everything, which was calm and specific and contained no performance. She said, "I also need your contact information for the purposes of the claim." He reached into the front pocket of his apron and produced a card. He handed it to her. She took it without looking at it. She said, "And the cart. This will need to be assessed for damage to my vehicle." He said, "I'd recommend we take photographs from both sides before either party moves anything." She looked at him again. He had already produced his phone and was photographing the contact point between the cart and the quarter panel, the position of the containers on the ground, the rice on the hood. He was doing this methodically and without drama, which was not the behavior she had expected from the person running the food cart. She looked at the card she had taken from him. If you are watching this from a city where a corner like this one exists, drop it in the comments below. Subscribe and ring the bell, because this one is about what a man builds when the building is not what anyone is looking at, and about what a woman finds when she finally looks at the card. Stay with me. Solomon Adeyemi had grown up in Lagos, in the Surulere neighborhood, in a household organized around the principle that the distance between where you were and where you intended to be was a project, not a complaint. His father, Femi, had come to the United States in 1987 on a student visa, completed a master's degree in urban planning at the University of Michigan, and returned to Lagos not because the opportunities in the United States were limited, but because the opportunities in Lagos were specifically available to someone who understood what Femi understood, which was the logic of how cities grew and where the pressure points were, and what happened to property when the pressure built long enough. Femi Adeyemi had spent 20 years advising the Lagos state government on infrastructure and land use, and had accumulated during those 20 years a parallel understanding of private real estate development that had eventually led him to leave government work and spend the next 15 years developing residential and commercial properties in Lagos, Abuja, and Accra. He had built a portfolio that was significant by any measure, and that he had managed with the conservatism of someone who had watched many people build things too fast and lose them, and who had decided early that the thing built slowly was the thing that stayed. Solomon had learned the specific mathematics of real estate not through any formal instruction, but through proximity to his father's work, through the Sunday morning conversations about land values and lease structures, and the rate at which neighborhoods changed when certain conditions were present. Conversations that Femi had with Solomon as naturally as other fathers talked about sport or weather, because the business was the organizing texture of the household, and Solomon had been in it from the beginning. What Femi had given him, beyond the technical language, was the understanding that real estate was a reading practice before it was anything else. A property was a text, and the text was not just the building itself but the block it was on, and the blocks around it, and the infrastructure adjacent to it, and the regulatory environment governing it, and the demographic patterns of the people moving toward it and away from it, and all of these things were readable if you had developed the habit of reading them. And the habit was what could not be taught in any school. It could only be developed through the practice of going to places and observing them over time, and asking whether your observations at one time were consistent with your observations 6 months later, and if they were not consistent, understanding why they were not, and revising your model accordingly. This was what Femi had done across 40 years of work in Lagos and Abuja and Accra. This was what Solomon had learned by watching him do it. He had come to the United States at 24, not on a student visa but on a work visa, having been offered a position at a commercial real estate firm in Chicago through a connection of his father's. A firm that worked specifically on urban mixed-use development and that had a reputation for doing the difficult deals, the ones where the site was complicated or the zoning was contested or the financing structure required something more creative than the standard approach. He had worked there for 6 years and had learned, specifically, what it meant to take a site that a conventional analysis would have dismissed and understand it well enough to see the outcome a different analysis would produce. The firm's reputation rested on this particular skill, and Solomon had been good at it from the beginning in a way that the firm's senior partners recognized and cultivated, giving him increasing responsibility on the complex projects, where the ability to read a situation differently from the consensus was the thing that made a deal possible. He had also learned in 6 years at the Chicago firm what the limits of institutional practice were, which was that an institution's judgment was always constrained by what the institution was willing to risk, and what an institution was willing to risk was always less than what a single person with correct judgment and sufficient conviction was willing to risk. He had seen 3 deals in his time at the firm that the firm had declined that he had believed were correct, and 2 of them had been acquired by independent operators and had performed exactly as he had believed they would perform, and the 3rd had been an error that he had analyzed correctly, but had also seen the risk factors in clearly enough that he was not surprised when it failed. He had left the Chicago firm understanding that the constraint was the institution and not the market, and that removing the constraint would expand the range of what was available to him, and that removing the constraint required capital he had not yet assembled, but that his father's position and his own track record were sufficient to begin assembling if he positioned himself correctly. Then he had moved to the city he was now in because his father's contact in Chicago had a friend in this city who was trying to put together a development project and needed someone who could read a deal the way Solomon read deals. He had stayed because the city had something the larger markets did not, which was a sufficient number of undervalued blocks to make a careful and patient investor's 10-year plan viable without the competition that compressed returns in Chicago or New York. He had spent the first 3 years here in partnership with the contact's friend, a Korean-American developer named James Park, and the partnership had been productive and had eventually been restructured when Solomon's own capital base had grown sufficient to fund acquisitions independently. He had been acquiring property on Aldrich Street and its immediate surroundings for 7 years, beginning with a single commercial building that he had identified as undervalued relative to the development pressure that was building 2 blocks north, and adding to the position as the thesis proved itself, and as the capital he had assembled permitted further acquisitions, and declining to sell when the offers arrived that would have validated the position early, because early validation was not the point of a 7-year thesis, and selling into it would have been a category error. The corner of Aldrich and Fenwick, which was the corner where the cart operated on weekday mornings, was in the middle of a block that Solomon owned entirely. He owned 211 Aldrich, which was Petra Halloran's building. He owned 213 and 215 Aldrich. He owned the building on the north face of the Fenwick corner and the mid-block building on the south face. He owned 6 properties on this block and 3 on the adjacent block and 2 in the next block south, and was under contract on a 4th that he expected to close before the end of the calendar year. The combined assessed value of what he owned was approximately $50 million, based on the most recent appraisals, which he kept current because current appraisals were a planning tool as much as a financial statement. The food cart was on the corner of Aldrich and Fenwick, because Solomon had decided that the corner needed foot traffic, and that foot traffic needed a reason to stop. And because the best food carts he had encountered in Lagos and New York and Chicago were operated by people who knew what they were doing, and who, if you gave them a good corner, would draw people to it, who would not otherwise be there. He had found the woman who ran the cart, a Jamaican-American woman named Clarissa, who had been running a catering operation out of her apartment for 3 years without a brick-and-mortar location, through a tenant in one of his buildings who had mentioned her, and he had offered her the corner with an arrangement that suited both of them. He ran the cart himself on Thursday mornings when Clarissa had a standing commitment, because the cart was not going to be on the corner and not open, and because he had told Clarissa it would be open, and he kept his word about things like that as a matter of operating practice rather than virtue. His son, Isaac, was 8 years old and had his father's quality of attention applied to the world in the form of a child who noticed things and then asked questions about what he had noticed, questions that were specific and that required specific answers, and who had since the age of 6 maintained a collection of what he called important facts in a small red notebook he carried in his backpack. Facts about the properties his father owned, and the way the properties worked, and the names of the people who were in them. He had told Solomon at 7 that he wanted to work with properties when he grew up, and Solomon had said, "Good," and had not made anything further of it, because the statement had been made the way serious statements are made by serious children, as a piece of information being deposited rather than a thing being performed, and the appropriate response to a piece of deposited information was to receive it and let it be there. Isaac was in school on Thursday mornings, which was the reason Solomon was able to be at the cart without bringing Isaac with him, which would have been the alternative, because Isaac had a school holiday on the following day and had already asked whether he could come to the cart on Friday, and Solomon had said yes, on the condition that Isaac completed a piece of work he had been putting off, and Isaac had accepted this condition with the visible reluctance of someone who intends to honor a deal he has agreed to. Isaac's mother, Yewande, had been in Solomon's life for 5 years, and in Isaac's for all of his, and had died of a cardiac event 3 years prior, on a Tuesday morning in January, with no forewarning. She had been a nurse practitioner, specific and precise, and in possession of a quality of care for people that was professional, and also something more than professional. The quality of someone who finds the work meaningful rather than merely competent, and she had brought this quality to everything she did, including Isaac, who had absorbed it in the way children absorb the governing qualities of the people they are closest to. The loss had reorganized Solomon's life the way major losses reorganize the lives of the people who sustain them, completely and permanently, and in ways that continued to present themselves over time rather than all at once. He had understood, within the first months, that the reorganization was not something to be resolved, but something to be accommodated, that the accommodation would be ongoing and would not have a completion date, and that the most honest approach to it was to build the life around the accommodation rather than around the expectation that the accommodation would eventually end. He had done this. He was still doing it. What had not changed was the work, not because the work was a refuge, but because the work was what he had promised to do, and he had never found promise-breaking to be a useful response to difficulty. The work was also, in a way he had not fully articulated to himself, what Yewande had expected of him. Not in an obligating sense, but in the sense of what she had known about him and had counted on, and he was not going to alter what she had known to be true. He had built the practice around Isaac's schedule with the exactness he brought to deal structures, identifying what was non-negotiable and building everything else around it. Mrs. Osai, a woman from his church who had known him since his first year in the city and who had an authority over Isaac that Isaac recognized and respected without being fully able to account for it, came 3 days a week. Solomon was home every evening, without exception. The Thursdays at the cart were the one irregular element of an otherwise predictable week, and they were irregular only in location, not in timing. Petra Halloran had looked at the card. She had looked at it in the car, after Solomon had collected the containers from the ground and from the hood of the rolls, with the equanimity of someone who has decided that equanimity is the appropriate response, and after she had driven back into the garage to make the calls that needed to be made, and after she had sat for a moment in the car in the garage, in the particular silence of a person who has had a surprising morning and is organizing it. She sat in the garage without her phone and without the radio, and she thought about the morning. She had been on the phone when she should have been watching the road. This was the factual foundation of everything that followed, and she was not going to adjust it. The cart had been stationary. The vehicle had been moving. She had been the moving thing. She had then gotten out of the car and said to the man whose cart she had hit, "I'm going to need your insurance information." She was a person who thought carefully about the language she used in professional and quasi-professional situations, and she was thinking carefully now about that sentence, which was not wrong as a sentence, but which had been delivered in a register that assumed a certain relationship between the two parties that the actual relationship did not support. She had been in the stronger position in the sentence, or had understood herself to be, and she was revising that understanding now. The card said, Solomon Adeyemi. Adeyemi Properties. It had a phone number and an address and a website URL. She knew the name Adeyemi Properties. She knew it because her firm, Halloran Capital, had looked at 2 properties in the past 18 months that had turned out, on due diligence, to be owned by Adeyemi Properties, and had not been able to acquire either of them because Adeyemi Properties had not been interested in selling. She had not dealt with the owner directly in either case. She had dealt with a representative. She had been under the impression, based on nothing more precise than the register in which the representative had communicated, that the owner of Adeyemi Properties was the kind of person whose representative spoke in a certain way. She had not been aware that the owner of Adeyemi Properties ran a food cart on Thursday mornings. She sat in the garage for a moment longer. Then she called her office and told her assistant to find out everything publicly available about Adeyemi Properties and have it on her desk by 2 o'clock. At 2:15 she read what her assistant had found. She read it with the specific quality of attention she brought to information that required a significant adjustment to a prior assumption, which was complete and without interruption and without the performance of equanimity, because she was alone in her office and did not need to perform anything for anyone. The portfolio was larger than she had understood. The block on Aldrich Street was larger than she had understood. The building she worked in, whose top 2 floors she leased for Halloran Capital, was among the properties in the portfolio. She was a tenant in Solomon Adeyemi's building. She had been a tenant in Solomon Adeyemi's building for 4 years, and she had just pushed his food cart into the street with her car. She put the file down and looked out the window at Aldrich Street for a moment. Then she called the number on the card. He answered on the second ring, which was how he answered things, and she identified herself and said she wanted to make a time to meet and discuss the morning's incident and also, she said, some other things. He said, "I'm available Thursday afternoon after 2:30. She said, "I could come to you." He said that would work. They met in his office, which was not in any of the buildings on Aldrich Street, but in a building on Fenwick, 2 blocks east, in a suite on the 3rd floor that was organized the way she had come to expect the offices of serious real estate people to be organized, which was functionally, and without the performance of success that she had learned to identify as the signature of people who were still proving something, rather than people who had proved it. There was a whiteboard on one wall with what appeared to be a site plan sketched on it, and there were maps on a second wall, and there was a desk that had been cleared for the meeting except for a yellow legal pad and a pen, and there was a window that looked out at Fenwick Street and from which, if you looked at the correct angle, you could see the corner of Aldrich and Fenwick, and the spot where the cart operated on Thursday mornings. She said, "I want to be straightforward with you about the morning." He said, "Please," she said. "I was on the phone. I was not attending to the road adequately. The contact between my vehicle and your cart was my fault." He said, "Yes," she said. "I'd like to handle the repair to the cart directly and without the involvement of my insurance, and I'd like to compensate you for the lost inventory." He said, "The cart has no structural damage. The 2 containers that fell had lids and the contents were recoverable except for the rice, which was on the hood." She said, "I'll cover the rice." He said, "The rice was approximately $20 worth of product." She said, "I'm aware the rice was $20 worth of product." He said, "I want you to know I'm not treating this as an opportunity." She said, "I know." He looked at her. She said, "I've been reading about you this afternoon." He said, "What have you been reading?" She said, "What's publicly available about Ademi properties." He said, "That's fairly limited." She said, "It was sufficient." He looked at the window for a moment. Then he said, "How long have you been in the building?" She said, 4 years. He said, "And you weren't aware of the ownership?" She said, "I dealt with your representative on the lease. I had an impression of the ownership that was inaccurate." He said, "What was the impression?" She said, "I thought the ownership was less substantial." He said, "Based on what?" She said, "Based on nothing I'm particularly proud of." He received this. He did not release her from it. He said, "What did you want to discuss?" "The things you mentioned on the phone." She said, "I wanted to apologize." "That's the first thing," she said. "And the second thing is I'd like to understand your development plans for the Aldrich block, because we've been looking at 2 properties in this corridor and both turned out to be yours, and I think there may be an alignment worth exploring." He said, "I'm familiar with the 2 inquiries." She said, and he said, "The properties weren't for sale because the timing wasn't right. Not because the inquiries weren't serious." She said, "And now?" He said, "The timing on one of them may be changing." She said, "I'd like to know more about that." He said, "I'd like to know more about what Halloran Capital is trying to do in this corridor." She said, "I can answer that." He said, "I know you can. That's why I'm asking." They talked for 2 hours. The conversation began with the Aldrich corridor and moved to the adjacent blocks and eventually to a third corridor 3 streets east that Solomon had been watching for 2 years and that Petra had not yet identified. He showed her the site plan on the whiteboard and the maps on the wall and explained his thesis about the development pressure and the timeline. And she listened with the quality of attention she brought to information that was better than what she had been working with, which was complete and without interjection until the moment interjection was useful. She said, toward the end of the second hour, "Who else are you working with on this?" He said, "James Park on the financing side, an architect named Mensa in Chicago on the planning side." She said, "I know James Park." He said, "Most people in this business know James Park." She said, "I know his work specifically. He structured the financing on the Millwood development 3 years ago." He said, "That was mine too." She said, "I know. I was looking at a site 2 blocks from it. I watched how the Millwood came together." He said, and, she said, "And whoever structured the financing understood the project's real value better than the appraisers did, which is unusual." He said, "James understood what we were building. The appraisers understood what had been built in similar locations before. Those are different understandings." She said, "Yes. That's the version of that distinction I've been trying to get the people at my firm to internalize for about 3 years." He looked at her. She said, "I'm not sure I've succeeded." He said, "What did you do instead?" She said, "I stopped delegating the site assessment work to people who apply the consensus framework. I do it myself or with one other person I trust." He said, how many properties has that changed your position on? She said, 7 in 4 years. He said, in what direction? She said, 4 that we passed on that we would have pursued under the consensus framework, and 3 that we pursued that the consensus framework would have passed on. He said, and the 3? She said, performing above projection. He said, and the 4? She said, of the 4 we passed on, 1 has underperformed and 3 have done what the consensus said they would do. She paused. She said, the one that underperformed I should have bought anyway. The risk was real, but the return profile was worth it, and I let the framework talk me out of it. He said, that's an honest account. She said, it's the accurate account. She said, what would a capital partner bring to this that you don't already have? He said, scale on the East Corridor. The project I have in mind is larger than what I want to capitalize alone. She said, what's the capital requirement? He told her. She did not write it down. She looked at the whiteboard for a moment. She said, that's manageable. He said, I know. She said, you weren't going to call us. He said, I was going to call you when the timing was right. He said, the timing is now closer to right than it was this morning. She said, because of the rice. He said, because you called the number on the card. She looked at him. He said, most people in that situation would have had their assistant call. Or their attorney. You called the number yourself. She said, it was my fault. He said, yes, and you called yourself to say so. She sat with this for a moment. She said, that should be standard practice. He said, it often isn't. She said, I know. The repair assessment for the rolls came in at $4,200 for the quarter panel, which Petra paid through her personal account rather than through the firm's insurance, and did not mention to anyone at the office, because the morning had produced a sequence of events that she was not inclined to publicize and that had cost her, in retrospect, somewhat less than she had expected, and considerably more in other ways that she was still accounting for. She had called her assistant after the meeting and asked for a briefing on everything the firm had looked at in the Aldrich corridor over the past 3 years, including the 2 properties they had pursued and not acquired. And she had read the briefing that evening at her kitchen table and identified 2 additional assessments the firm had made that had not risen to the level of formal pursuit, but that, given what she now knew about the ownership structure on the block, deserved a second look. She made notes in the margin of the briefing in the way she made notes when she was working through something that mattered, which was specifically and in full sentences rather than shorthand, because shorthand was for things she was confident she would remember and full sentences were for things she needed to be able to read correctly later. She called James Park on a Friday morning, 3 days after the incident. She said, I understand you're working with Solomon Adeyemi on the East Corridor project. James Park said, I'm doing some financing structure work. Yes, she said. I had a conversation with him on Thursday. I think there's a potential capital partnership. James Park was quiet for a moment. Then he said, how did you meet Solomon? She said, his food cart and my car had a disagreement. James Park said nothing for a moment. Then he said, the Thursday cart. She said, yes. He said, how bad was it? She said, it was $4,000 and $20 worth of rice. He was quiet again. Then he said, he's very good, Petra. If he's talking to you about the East Corridor, it means he thinks you're worth talking to. She said, I know. He said, don't negotiate like you're in the stronger position. You're not in the stronger position. She said, I know that too. He said, good. I'll call him. Solomon told Isaac about it on the Friday, which was the day Isaac came to the cart. They opened it together at 8 in the morning, Solomon explaining the setup and Isaac doing the parts he had been taught, and handling the containers with the seriousness of a child who has been told that the containers matter and has taken this as a binding instruction. At 9:15, in the gap between the morning rush and the late morning steady stream, Isaac said, what happened to the dent in the cart? Solomon looked. There was a small deformation on the right side of the cart, near the lower shelf from the contact with the quarter panel. It was not affecting the function of the cart. It was visible if you were looking for it. He said, a car hit it on Thursday. Isaac said, how? He explained. Isaac said, was the person okay? Solomon said, yes, the car was more affected than the person. Isaac said, what about the cart? Solomon said, the cart works. The dent will stay. Isaac looked at the dent for a moment with the assessing quality of attention that Solomon had been noticing in him for the past year. The beginning of the ability to read the history of an object from its surface. He said, it's not that bad. Solomon said, no, it's not. Isaac said, are you going to fix it? Solomon said, I don't think so. He said, some things record what happened to them, and that's fine. Isaac thought about this. He said, the rice went on the car. Solomon said, yes. He said, that's kind of funny. Solomon said, in retrospect, yes. Isaac went back to the cart and adjusted the position of a container that did not need adjusting, but that he had decided needed adjusting, with the confidence of someone who has been given a small amount of authority and has taken the authority seriously. At 11:30, the morning winding down, a woman walked up to the cart that Isaac recognized from somewhere and could not place. She looked at the dent in the side of the cart and then at Solomon and said, the dent is smaller than I expected. He said, it tends to look larger in memory. She looked at Isaac. She said, is this your son? He said, this is Isaac. She introduced herself to Isaac with her full name, which Isaac repeated once to confirm he had it right, which was a habit he had and which she appeared to notice. She said to Isaac, I hit your father's cart with my car on Thursday. Isaac looked at her, then at his father, then at the dent. He said, you put the rice on the car. She said, yes, he said. How much rice? She said a considerable amount. He appeared to consider this an adequate account. He said, my dad says some things record what happened to them. She looked at the dent. She said, yes, I think that's right. She bought an order of oxtail and paid for it correctly, and thanked Isaac for the correct change, and walked down Aldrich Street in the September morning. Isaac watched her go and then turned back to the cart. He said, she was nice. Solomon said, yes. Isaac said, is she the one from the East Corridor? Solomon had mentioned the East Corridor at dinner the previous evening in terms he had believed were general enough for an 8-year-old, which apparently they were not. He said, yes. Isaac said, is she going to be useful? Solomon said, I think so. Isaac said, good. He went back to the cart. Solomon looked at the dent in the side of the cart, and then at Isaac, who had already moved on to the next thing with the efficiency of someone whose attention is not wasted on what is already settled, and at the September morning on Aldrich Street, which was his block in a specific and concrete sense that still, after 7 years, contained something he found worth attending to. The light in September was different from the light in June, when the cart had first been on the corner, and the block itself was different in ways that were visible if you had been watching it carefully, which he had, which was the work. He attended to it for a moment before the next customer arrived. Then the next customer arrived, and he attended to that instead.